It was 8:42 in the morning on November 9th, 1944, and Winston Churchill was reading the morning newspapers in his study at 10 Downing Street when he came across an article that made his blood pressure spike dangerously. The headline proclaimed Montgomery's brilliant strategy opens Antwerp, and the article went on to describe how Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group had successfully cleared the Scheldt estuary in a masterful operation that would finally allow the vital port of Antwerp to supply Allied forces. The article quoted Montgomery extensively, praising his meticulous planning and bold execution. It mentioned British forces prominently. What it did not mention, not even once in 15 paragraphs, was that the operation had been fought almost entirely by Canadian troops, that over 6,000 Canadian casualties had been suffered in some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war, and that Canadian generals had planned and executed the tactics that made success possible. Churchill set down the newspaper with exaggerated care. The kind of deliberate gentleness that his staff had learned meant he was absolutely furious. He called for his private secretary, and when the young man appeared, Churchill pointed at the offending article. "Get me the actual operational reports from the Scheldt campaign," he said quietly. "I want to know exactly which forces did the fighting and which commanders planned the operations, and then get me a telephone connection to Field Marshal Montgomery. I will be speaking with him this afternoon." The Scheldt campaign had been one of the most critical operations of the autumn of 1944. After the liberation of Paris and the rapid advance across France and Belgium, Allied forces had captured the massive port of Antwerp intact in early September, a stunning achievement that should have solved the Allies' growing logistics crisis. But the Germans still controlled the Scheldt estuary, the waterway leading from the North Sea to Antwerp, which meant the port was useless despite being in Allied hands. Ships couldn't reach Antwerp, while German forces held both banks of the estuary and the fortified islands between. Opening the Scheldt became the most urgent priority for autumn operations, the key to maintaining the Allied advance and preventing the supply lines from collapsing entirely. Montgomery, as commander of 21st Army Group, which included British, Canadian, and Polish forces, was responsible for the operation. But Montgomery had initially been reluctant to prioritize the Scheldt, preferring to focus on his proposed thrust toward the Ruhr and his ill-fated Operation Market Garden. It was only after Eisenhower had essentially ordered him to clear the Scheldt that Montgomery had given the task proper attention. And when he did assign forces to the operation, he gave it almost entirely to 1st Canadian Army under General Harry Crerar, with the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions and the 4th Canadian Armored Division bearing the brunt of the fighting. The campaign had been a nightmare. The Scheldt estuary was a landscape of flooded polders, fortified islands, and determined German defenders who knew that losing the estuary meant losing Antwerp and hastening Germany's defeat. Canadian troops had fought through waist-deep water, had assaulted heavily fortified positions with minimal cover, had cleared fortified towns, house by house, in brutal close combat. The Germans had defended with the desperation of men who understood this was one of their last chances to delay Allied victory. The fighting had lasted from early October through early November, and the Canadian casualties had been devastating. Over 6,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. Some battalions had lost 50% of their strength. It was some of the costliest fighting Canadians had experienced since the Normandy campaign, but they had succeeded. By early November, the last German positions had been cleared, the estuary was open, and minesweepers were working to clear the channel so that ships could finally reach Antwerp. It was an unambiguous Canadian victory, achieved through Canadian blood and Canadian tactical skill. The commanders who had planned the operation were Canadian. The troops who had executed it were Canadian. The casualties had been overwhelmingly Canadian. And now, Montgomery was taking credit for it in the British press, describing it as his strategy and his success, relegating the actual fighters to footnotes if mentioning them at all. Churchill's secretary returned within 2 hours with the operational reports. Churchill read through them carefully, his anger growing with each page. The documents confirmed what he'd suspected. Canadian units had conducted the assaults. Canadian commanders had developed the tactics for fighting in flooded terrain. Canadian engineers had solved the technical problems of attacking fortified positions across water obstacles. British involvement had been minimal, limited mostly to artillery support and some flanking operations. This was a Canadian victory being presented to the British public as a British achievement, and Churchill found this both morally offensive and politically dangerous. The political dimension was what particularly concerned Churchill. Canada had been at war since September 1939, had mobilized over 1 million men and women from a population of only 11 million, had suffered tens of thousands of casualties, and had paid enormous financial costs. Canadian public opinion was increasingly sensitive about whether Canada's contributions were being properly recognized by Britain and the other allies. Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King was under constant pressure from his political opponents who argued that Canada was being treated as a British subordinate rather than an independent ally, that Canadian soldiers were being used as cannon fodder while British commanders took the glory. Churchill understood this dynamic because he'd been managing it carefully throughout the war. He made regular speeches praising Canadian contributions. He ensured that Canadian achievements were highlighted in official communications. He maintained close relations with Mackenzie King precisely because he knew that Canadian support for the war effort depended on Canadians feeling that their sacrifices were valued and recognized. And now, Montgomery had undermined all of that careful work by claiming credit for a Canadian victory in a way that made it seem like Canadians had been mere auxiliaries in a British operation. The telephone connection to Montgomery's headquarters was established at 3 o'clock that afternoon. Churchill picked up the receiver and got directly to the point without the usual pleasantries. Field Marshal, I have been reading the morning newspapers with considerable interest and growing alarm. There is an extensive article about the Scheldt operation which quotes you at length and gives the impression that this was primarily a British achievement under your brilliant command. I've also been reading the actual operational reports, which tell a rather different story. Perhaps you can explain this discrepancy? Montgomery's voice came through the line, confident and seemingly unbothered by Churchill's tone. Prime Minister, the press always simplifies these matters. Obviously, the Canadians played an important role in the operation, but as overall commander of 21st Army Group, the strategic planning and coordination were my responsibility. I believe that's what the article was referring to. Churchill's grip on the telephone receiver tightened. Field Marshal, let me be very clear about what I have just read in the operational reports. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division conducted the assault on the Breskins Pocket. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division cleared South Beveland. The 4th Canadian Armoured Division supported operations on both flanks. Canadian engineers solved the technical problems of attacking across flooded terrain. Canadian artillery provided the bulk of fire support. Canadian casualties exceeded 6,000 men. British involvement was marginal by comparison. This was not a case of Canadians playing an important role. This was a Canadian operation from start to finish. There was a pause on the line. When Montgomery spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more defensive. The overall command structure and strategic framework were established by my headquarters. The Canadians executed the plan excellently, but the plan itself reflected my operational vision for clearing the estuary. Churchill had anticipated this argument and had his response ready. I have here the planning documents for the Scheldt operations. They show that General Simons and General Crerar developed the tactical approaches for the specific assaults. Your headquarters provided general objectives and timelines, but the actual methods for achieving those objectives were developed by Canadian commanders who understood the terrain and the challenges better than your British staff officers. You assigned the mission to the Canadians and then largely left them to solve the problems themselves. That is delegation, not strategic brilliance. Montgomery attempted to defend his position. Prime Minister, with respect, as Army Group Commander, I am responsible for all operations conducted by forces under my command. When those operations succeed, the credit naturally flows upward through the chain of command. This is how military organizations function. Churchill cut him off. Field Marshal, I am well aware of how military organizations function. I am also aware of how political considerations function, and you seem remarkably oblivious to the political damage you are causing. Do you have any idea of the situation in Canada, right now? Do you understand that Mackenzie King is fighting to maintain Canadian commitment to the war effort against opposition that claims Canada is being used and abused by Britain? Do you comprehend that articles like the one I read this morning provide ammunition to those opponents, that they can point to a Canadian victory being claimed by a British commander as proof that Canada is not respected as an independent ally? There was a longer pause this time. Montgomery's response when it came sounded slightly chastened. I was not aware of the political sensitivities in Canada. My focus has been on military operations rather than public relations. Churchill's voice took on an edge that his secretary, listening from across the room, would later describe as glacial. Then allow me to educate you on those political sensitivities, Field Marshal. Canada is not a British possession. It is an independent dominion that chose to enter this war by its own sovereign decision. Canadian troops, Serve under your command because the Canadian government agreed to integrate their forces into British command structures, not because you have any inherent authority over them. That agreement depends entirely on Canadian confidence that their forces will be properly led and their achievements properly recognized. When you claim credit for victories won by Canadian blood, you undermine that confidence and you risk fracturing the alliance that is essential to winning this war. Montgomery tried to respond, but Churchill continued without pause. Let me make this absolutely clear. You will contact the British press immediately and issue a clarification. You will state explicitly that the Scheldt operation was planned and executed by Canadian forces under Canadian command. You will name General Crerar and General Simons specifically. You will detail the Canadian casualties and the Canadian tactical innovations that made success possible. You will make it unmistakably clear that this was a Canadian victory in which you had a coordinating role but not an operational role. Is that understood? The line was silent for a moment. Then Montgomery spoke, his tone now stripped of its earlier confidence. Prime Minister, issuing such a clarification will make it appear that I was trying to steal credit from the Canadians. It will be embarrassing for me personally and potentially damaging to my reputation. Churchill's response was immediate and sharp. Yes, it will be embarrassing. You have earned that embarrassment by your conduct. Your reputation will survive because you have genuine achievements to your name, achievements that don't require you to appropriate the victories of others. But if you do not issue this clarification immediately, I will do it for you. I will release a statement from 10 Downing Street correcting the record, and I will make sure everyone understands that the Prime Minister felt compelled to intervene because you refused to give proper credit to Allied forces. Which option would you prefer? Another pause, then Montgomery's voice, quiet and defeated. I will issue the clarification today. Good, Churchill said. And Field Marshal, let me give you some additional guidance for the future. The Canadian forces under your command are not British troops who happen to be stationed in Canada. They are sovereign forces contributed by an independent ally. They deserve the same respect and recognition you would give to American forces or to Free French forces. When they achieve victories, those victories belong to Canada, not to Britain, and certainly not to you personally. If you cannot understand and accept this, then perhaps we need to reconsider your command of army groups that include substantial Canadian forces. The implicit threat in that statement was unmistakable. Churchill was suggesting that Montgomery's position could be at risk if he continued to disrespect Canadian contributions. For Montgomery, whose ego was built around his role as Britain's most prominent field commander, this was a serious warning. I understand, Prime Minister, Montgomery said. It will not happen again. Churchill hung up the telephone and sat back in his chair, still angry, but satisfied that he'd made his point forcefully enough that Montgomery would comply. He dictated a cable to Mackenzie King informing the Canadian Prime Minister that he'd addressed the matter of the press coverage, that Montgomery had been directed to issue a proper acknowledgement of Canadian achievements, and that Churchill personally wanted to express Britain's profound gratitude for Canadian sacrifices in the Scheldt campaign. The cable was sent within the hour. Montgomery's clarification appeared in the British press the following day. It was brief and clearly written under duress, but it did what Churchill had demanded. Montgomery stated that the Scheldt operation had been conducted primarily by 1st Canadian Army, that Generals Crerar and Simons had developed the tactical plans, that Canadian troops had borne the brunt of the fighting and the casualties, and that their success in extremely difficult conditions reflected great credit on Canadian arms. The statement wasn't generous or fulsome, but it was accurate, and it corrected the record. The Canadian press picked up the clarification and ran it prominently, noting that Churchill had apparently intervened to ensure proper recognition of Canadian achievements. Mackenzie King released a statement thanking Churchill for his support and praising Canadian troops for their magnificent performance in one of the war's most difficult campaigns. The political crisis that had been brewing was diffused, at least temporarily. But the incident revealed deeper tensions that would persist throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. Montgomery never fully accepted that Canadian forces were independent allies rather than British subordinates. He continued to view himself as the primary architect of victories achieved by forces under his command, regardless of who actually planned and executed the operations. His relationship with Canadian commanders remained strained, with both Crerar and Simons reporting that Montgomery treated them with condescension and seemed perpetually annoyed that he had to coordinate with commanders he viewed as inferior. Churchill, for his part, had to repeatedly intervene to ensure that Canadian contributions were properly recognized. He made sure that Canadian achievements were highlighted in his speeches to Parliament. He ensured that Canadian commanders received appropriate decorations and honors. He maintained regular communication with Mackenzie King, carefully managing the political relationship that kept Canada committed to the war effort. This was exhausting work that took time and attention away from other matters, but Churchill understood it was essential. The alliance with Canada was too important to risk through British arrogance or Montgomery's ego. The broader pattern of Canadian contributions being minimized or attributed to British forces persisted throughout the war and into the post-war period. When histories of the war were written, they tended to focus on British and American forces, relegating Canadian achievements to footnotes or brief mentions. The Scheldt Campaign, despite being one of the most significant operations of autumn 1944, received far less attention than Market Garden, Montgomery's failed operation that had preceded it. The Canadian role in liberating the Netherlands, which created bonds between Canada and the Dutch that persist to this day, was often portrayed as a minor part of larger British operations rather than a distinct Canadian achievement. Part of this minimization was structural. Canada was a much smaller country than Britain or the United States, which meant Canadian forces were fewer in number even though they were proportionally enormous, given Canada's population. Histories tend to focus on the largest forces and the most dramatic operations, which meant American and British actions dominated the narrative. Part of it was also about media and propaganda. The British and American governments had sophisticated propaganda operations that shaped how the war was presented to domestic and international audiences. Canada's propaganda efforts were more modest, which meant Canadian achievements weren't promoted as aggressively. But part of the minimization was also about commanders like Montgomery, who genuinely seemed to believe that victories achieved under their command belonged to them personally, regardless of which forces actually did the fighting. This attitude was particularly galling when applied to Canadian forces because Canadians had chosen to fight in a war that wasn't directly threatening Canada, had crossed an ocean to defend principles and allies, and had every right to expect that their sacrifices would be acknowledged and honored rather than appropriated by British commanders seeking glory. Churchill understood this dynamic and fought against it repeatedly, but he was swimming against strong currents. The British military establishment had centuries of tradition treating Dominion forces as extensions of British power rather than as independent allies. Many British officers had served in India or other imperial possessions where they'd commanded colonial troops, and they carried those attitudes into their interactions with Canadian forces. The idea that Canadians deserved equal credit and equal respect was intellectually accepted but emotionally resisted by many British commanders who'd been raised in an imperial system that assumed British superiority. The incident over the Scheldt credit became part of Canadian military lore, though the details were often garbled in the retelling. Canadian veterans would tell stories about how Churchill had defended Canadian honor against Montgomery's attempt to steal their victory, how the Prime Minister had forced Montgomery to acknowledge Canadian achievements. The story became a point of pride, evidence that at least someone in British leadership had understood what Canadians had accomplished and had been willing to fight for proper recognition. But the story also highlighted the fundamental problem with integrated command structures, where forces from multiple nations served under commanders from a dominant power. The Canadian forces were good enough to be given the hardest tasks, the missions that promised high casualties and required exceptional skill and determination. The Scheldt Campaign was a perfect example, a brutal operation that Montgomery gave to the Canadians, because he knew they could accomplish it despite the terrible conditions and heavy losses. But when those missions succeeded, the credit flowed upward to British commanders rather than remaining with the Canadians who'd actually done the fighting and dying. This pattern created resentment that persisted long after the war ended. Canadian veterans felt that their achievements had been stolen, that they'd fought and bled for victories that history books attributed to British generals. Younger Canadians learning about the war in school encountered narratives that minimized Canadian roles, that portrayed Canada as a junior partner helping Britain rather than as an independent nation making enormous sacrifices by choice. This contributed to growing Canadian nationalism in the post-war decades, a determination to assert Canadian independence and resist British attempts to maintain imperial relationships. Churchill's intervention in the Scheldt credit dispute was one of many instances where he tried to navigate these complicated dynamics. He genuinely appreciated Canadian contributions and understood that Canadian support couldn't be taken for granted. But he also had to manage British public opinion, which wanted to see British forces and British commanders as the primary agents of victory. Balancing these competing demands required constant attention and occasional forceful interventions like the telephone call to Montgomery. The irony was that Montgomery's attempt to claim credit for the Scheldt actually diminished his own reputation in the long run. Historians studying the campaign recognized that Canadian forces had done the actual fighting and that Montgomery's contribution had been limited to assigning the mission and providing resources. When Montgomery's memoirs were published after the war, they continued to downplay Canadian achievements, which led Canadian historians to conduct detailed studies proving the extent of Canadian contributions. These studies made clear that Montgomery had tried to appropriate a Canadian victory, which tarnished his legacy and made him a figure of resentment in Canada. The soldiers who'd actually fought in the Scheldt never forgot what they'd accomplished or what it had cost. They'd waded through freezing water while machine guns cut down their comrades. They'd cleared bunkers and pillboxes one by one in close combat. They'd endured artillery bombardments and counterattacks and the grinding exhaustion of continuous operations. They knew exactly who had won that victory, and it wasn't Montgomery sitting in his headquarters issuing orders. It was the Canadian infantryman who'd assaulted the Breskin's pocket. It was the Canadian tanker who'd supported operations in South Beveland. It was the Canadian engineer who'd built bridges across flooded terrain under fire. Those men owned that victory in ways that no general could claim, and they resented having their achievement stolen by someone who'd contributed planning, but not blood. When the war ended and veterans returned to Canada, many of them remained bitter about how their contributions had been minimized. They'd seen British and American commanders take credit for victories the Canadians had won. They'd read newspaper accounts that barely mentioned Canadian forces or relegated them to supporting roles when they'd actually been the primary combat forces. This bitterness influenced Canadian attitudes toward Britain in the post-war period, contributing to Canada's gradual drift away from close imperial ties and toward a more independent foreign policy. Churchill's death in 1965 prompted reflection on his relationship with Canada and the Commonwealth. Canadian newspapers ran articles noting that while Churchill had been an imperialist in many ways, he'd also shown consistent respect for Canadian sovereignty and Canadian contributions during the war. The incident over Scheldt credit was mentioned in several obituaries as an example of Churchill standing up for Canada against British military arrogance. For many Canadians, that intervention mattered more than his grand strategic decisions or famous speeches. It showed that he understood Canada as an independent ally deserving respect, not as a colonial possession to be used and ignored. Montgomery lived until 1976 and never fully acknowledged how his attitude toward Canadian forces had damaged his reputation. In interviews late in his life, he continued to portray himself as the architect of all victories achieved by forces under his command, downplaying the contributions of subordinate commanders, whether they were British, Canadian, or otherwise. This stubborn refusal to share credit became one of the defining characteristics of his legacy, a flaw that historians noted alongside his genuine military abilities. The Scheldt campaign itself became better known as Canadian historians worked to recover the story and ensure it was properly told. Books and documentaries detailed the brutal fighting, the innovative tactics, the heavy casualties, and the strategic importance of opening Antwerp. The campaign was taught in Canadian military colleges as an example of successful operations in difficult terrain. Veterans, organizations made sure the story was passed to younger generations, determined that Canadian achievements would not be forgotten or minimized by histories written from British or American perspectives. The fundamental lesson that emerged from the Scheldt credit dispute was about power and narrative in coalitions. The nation that controls the narrative controls how history remembers events. Britain and America had larger propaganda machines, more influential historians, and greater presence in international discourse. This gave them power to shape how the war was remembered, often in ways that minimized the contributions of smaller allies like Canada. Fighting against this narrative power required constant vigilance and advocacy, which Canadian political and military leaders learned to provide but which shouldn't have been necessary in the first place. Churchill's intervention on behalf of Canadian recognition was important not just for what it accomplished immediately but for what it represented. It demonstrated that leaders could choose to acknowledge all contributors to victory rather than hoarding credit for their own nations or commanders. It showed that political leaders could override military commanders when broader alliance considerations required it. And it validated Canadian complaints about being undervalued, giving official weight to grievances that might otherwise have been dismissed as colonial sensitivity. The story of what Churchill said when Montgomery claimed credit for the Canadian victory at the Scheldt is ultimately a story about respect and recognition in alliances. It reveals that military success depends not just on tactical skill and material resources, but also on managing the human and political dimensions of coalition warfare. It shows that leaders must balance military efficiency with political sensitivity, that using forces effectively means acknowledging their contributions honestly. And it reminds us that behind every victory are real soldiers who bled and died, and those soldiers and their nations deserve to have their sacrifices recognized truthfully rather than appropriated by commanders seeking personal glory. Churchill understood this. Montgomery did not. That difference in understanding shaped how each man is remembered in Canada today, one with gratitude and the other with resentment, one as a defender of Canadian honor and the other as a symbol of the imperial arrogance that Canadians fought to overcome.